Alrighty, welcome to the first lesson that we're doing from Unit 6, where we're going to talk all about energy, everything you did and did not want to know. So, our first lesson is going to be about how we use energy around the world and also how our use of it has changed over time. The most widely used source of energy around the world has been primarily fossil fuels for at least the last 100 years or so. So if you look, the highlighted fuel sources are all fossil fuels. So natural gas, oil, and coal are all considered fossil fuels. And notice how they make up a very large portion of the world's energy consumption. We're going to talk about why this is an issue later, especially when we get into Unit 9 with climate change. Energy resources aren't really distributed evenly between developed and developing countries. And that means basically energy usage is not distributed evenly. So some people use more energy than others. This is distributed mostly by country. So before we get into how the energy use differs, let's talk about what our AP test defines as a developed versus a developing country. So a developed country is going to be one which tends to have higher income. People have a higher quality of life, a higher standard of living. There's a highly developed economy and a lot of advanced industrial technology. You can see that a lot of the areas where there are developed countries are, for example, North America, Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, and then Japan and South Korea, as well as a few other isolated spots. So a developing country is usually going to have kind of the opposite of that: lower income, lower quality of life, less industrialization, perhaps a less developed economy. And some examples are China, India, much of Asia, Africa, and South America. Now, I did get some questions from students when I talked about this in class about whether China is considered a developed country. I will say that this is data based from the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund as of 2022. So I don't know when China will change status to become characterized as a developed nation, but it's probably on its way, well on its way. Mexico is probably well on its way as well, and there are probably several other countries that within the next 5 to 10 years would be considered a more developed nation. Another thing that is different in developed countries, you do tend to have um, probably more urban residents, people living in cities. And in developing countries, you tend to have people who are more higher rural population, where people are living in the countryside. In developed countries, their economy is going to be more dependent on industry or even service. And then in developing countries, their economy may be more dependent on agriculture. All right, per capita use of energy differs between developed and developing countries quite a bit. And a reminder, per capita means per person. So that means if we look at this at this graph right here, notice the deep red means very heavy energy use per person. And if we look at that, it looks like kind of the one of the heaviest users is Canada, right up here. And if you think about it, it makes some sense because Canada does tend to have colder weather year round. And energy use includes not just use of electricity, but also use of, for example, heat generation, and motor vehicle transport and everything. Notice a lot of the developed countries tend to be very heavy energy users per person. And then some countries that weren't on the developed country list are also very heavy energy users. But in general, the less developed a country is, the less energy that's being used per person. This changes because this is different because with the higher standard of living, people tend to have more vehicles, more electronic devices, all of which are using energy. And then with more industrialization and more industry, then factories and other industry related businesses and such tend to use more energy as well. Now, Another thing to note is as developing countries increase their development, they tend to start relying on fossil fuels more. So here is a graph showing China's energy consumption between 1965 and 2013, and it's divided up by different types. So I'm going to circle the types that are fossil fuels, and you'll notice that over time, while China was experiencing this heavy industrialization in the last half of the 20th century, their use of coal, especially, but fossil fuels in general, increased exponentially. And so, as they began industrializing, they started using a lot more fossil fuels. This trend is very similar to the global trend of energy use as more and more countries uh, raise their standard of living, for example, or become more industrialized, they use more energy. So, for example, what I have on the bottom graph, on the top graph, it's looking at world energy consumption, and it is divided by type of energy, but you can just see that the use of energy has increased exponentially. If you look at the bottom graph, this is between 2006 and 2015, and it's looking at the number of passenger cars and commercial vehicles in use around the world. So the dark blue is passenger cars and the light blue is commercial vehicles. Notice just between 2006 and 2015, there is a noticeable increase in the number of vehicles. That's the only graph I was able to really find with this. Um, but if you were looking at a graph, say from 1950 onwards, you would definitely notice a dramatic increase in the number of cars around the world. And then also, when not just used by people, but as industrialization increases, then industry is going to use more energy as well. So, there are some factors that influence which energy sources people are going to use. The first one is availability. If you don't have access to it, you're not really going to be able to use it. So, for example, what people use to cook. So, the fuel they use to cook depends on what's available in the region. So, for example, in the United States, there are plenty of people who use natural gas. That's very dramatically high in Texas because we produce a lot of natural gas. And electricity is also used in more rural areas. They may use wood and other biofuels as well, in instead. So, for example, if you're living in a rural area of sub-Saharan Africa, your major cooking fuel source may be wood, or it may be well. So my dad used to tell me stories. They used to use animal dung, so basically dried poop, as a fuel source as well for cooking because it burns very well. In that was in India, by the way, in like the 1950s. Price is also obviously going to be impacting things. Obviously, the cheapest fuel is going to be used the most. People will tend to want to, save money as much as possible. And then the government can influence which energy sources people are using. So the government can subsidize or financially support certain fuel types. One example of this is when gas prices are high and when the supply is low, the US can choose to release some of the oil that it's got saved in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve or the Strategic Oil Reserve. And when that happens, that'll lower the price of gasoline, or make sure that gasoline is just still available, and that will increase gasoline usage. All right, so that was hopefully a very quick set of notes. Look for more to come in the future for Unit 6.